Well, good morning, church. It's good to be here, and I know I am free to go and not be here, free to do whatever. The doors are not locked, but that was not always the case for those who came before us. Let's look at the recusants of the 17th and 18th centuries and see if there are any lessons to be learned. I know that there are those who might say, but why talk of times so far away? To those, I would answer that there are huge lessons to be learned from what happened about 2,000 years ago. And granted, to a much lesser extent, there are lessons to be learned from just 400 years ago. It can be as relevant as what happened to us all last year. So let's turn back in time to some of the subjects from those troubled days. Let's see if there is anything to be learned. The close of the 16th century and the start of the 17th was a very turbulent time for the good citizens of England. It's important to note that even then, they were all considered subjects. That is, they were subject to the control of the crown, the king or the queen. No one was really free as we understand the word today. King Henry VIII had literally taken over all the religious structures, the buildings, the houses, the monasteries, all the buildings that had belonged to the church in Rome, the Roman Catholics. His legal theory was that because he was king, he had made himself ruler of the church. Then everything that the Roman Church previously owned belonged to him personally. At that time, the official church was a real mess, to put it mildly. Corruption was well entrenched, and many really weird things had crept into the faith that were not at all Bible-based. The exchange of money for forgiveness of sins was a particularly profitable money stream for the church. You could buy forgiveness, as well as mandatory tithing. Attendance at church was also mandatory. Henry persuaded the Parliament to pass laws that supported his takeover. He did not do it just by royal command. He did it by following all the legal requirements of the time, with carefully written laws voted in by Parliament. There was, however, some arm twisting involved with the various members, and some with dire threats. Recusant was a word that echoed back then. It meant, according to the Google Online Dictionary, a person who refuses to submit to an authority or to comply with a regulation. Well, that's a big thing, and that's worth repeating. A recusant is a person who refuses to submit to an authority or to comply with a regulation. Now, according to Merriam-Webster, recusant means an English Roman Catholic of the time from about 1570 to 1791 who refused to attend services of the Church of England and thereby committed a statutory offense. Oh dear, Merriam and Webster, we need to talk. You are partly correct. It's probably a sad day when I say Google is more correct than Merriam-Webster. But in this case, I'm saying it. So maybe there is a tiny little bit of hope for Google after all. So a recusant who could lose his house for not going to church was a rule breaker. That's kind of Captain Obvious. At the risk of giving you painful flashbacks from the old days at school, the word recusant is rooted in the Latin recusare, which means to reject or oppose. It's one of those present participles, a seeing is believing, gerundival kind of thing. Whoa, that gives you a headache. There are those who still persist in using it like a judge who who recuses himself from a trial involving his brother or mother. Maybe excuse would be a better choice of words for that. So let's go back to the recusants, the rule breakers. Before King Henry VIII, the subjects of England, all of them, including the king or queen, were required to be Catholics, and all were subject to the Pope in Rome. It has been said that the first inkling that the subjects had that the Pope was not in control of everything and all-powerful came in the same way that the present COVID plague visited with us. So very many people died of the plague back then that they questioned the infallibility of the Pope. The first English plague, the Black Death of 1347 to 1352, created doubt and chatter. But back then, the average peasant woman visited the church maybe 3 or 4, 5 times a day. It was a method for some of getting away from the horrible grind of life, an island, if you will. During the late 1500s, the voices of the Reformation were getting louder and louder. The words of Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, that Martin Luther, were filtering around, and serious students were taking notice. Some scholars found that his words seemed to match the words of the Bible. When King Henry VIII did his restructuring of the English church, he created rules whereby he was now the boss and not the Pope. The king kept most of the pageantry and the odd things alive, but just after Henry's death, the next ruler, King Henry VI, pushed the use of the Book of Common Prayer. This replaced the stack of books that was previously used in Latin, known as the Latin Rite or the Serum. Almost all of the subjects of the crown did not understand Latin one bit. You can just imagine the reaction of the folks when the services were understandable and read in the English language. I don't know if you remember some time ago when I talked about the hocus pocus, the hocus pocus. That was when the peasants thought what was being said during the services was really what they thought was hocus pocus was the priests chanting in Latin, hoc est corpus meum, which means, this is my body. It was part of the communion service, English. It was part of what we would call breaking of the bread. The peasants really thought that the priests were chanting the words, hocus pocus, if you can imagine that. The mandatory use of the Book of Common Prayer caused all kinds of trouble. For example, a wedding could not be performed if there was no ring, because the instructions in the prayer book required a ring. It was a script that the priests had to follow, and they better had, or there was trouble. If you were getting married and wanted to change the vows that were in the prayer book, you could get in serious trouble just for asking. Just to change one word from the authorized text was a major offense. You may have heard the recent story of a priest in San Diego who changed one word in his church's baptismal service. He changed an I to we, and therefore all of the thousands of baptisms he performed with that word change have been declared null and void by the church leadership. At least these days, they don't hang a priest for an error like that. Oh dear, all those babies' baptisms are null and void. Well, that's a discussion for another day. We won't get into that. The largest group among the recusants were the Catholics, who objected to the whole takeover by Henry. But among the Catholic recusants were others, and in that group were two distinct smaller groups who would also not attend church services. These are the folks that Merriam-Webster missed entirely. There were some important people in those small groups. There was a group called the Puritans, who wished to purify the church using pressure. They thought they could fix it. You could call them hopeful dissidents. There was also a group of separatists who were much like the Puritans, but wished to go away and have their religious freedom somewhere else. They felt that the current church was beyond repair, that they had given up hope on the official mandatory church. Many of these folks were followers of Robert Brown, or Trouble Church Brown, as the Queen called him. You have to be in trouble to get a nickname from the Queen, trust me. It was from this group that a lot of the pilgrims came. As things went, many of the followers of Trouble Church Brown were hanged, but he, due to his wealthy family connections, stayed alive, although he was thrown in jail more than 60 times. Two of his followers, Mr. Barrow and Mr. Greenwood, were arrested as they distributed his books and tracts that he printed in Holland, where he had run away to. And they were in a great deal of trouble. They were being tried, and the words were captured in the records and reported in a book called The History of the Puritans, written by Daniel Neil back in 1811. I have modified the text a little for clarity, but not changed the meaning. So let's visit the trial of a recusant by the name of Mr. Barrow. The Lord Treasurer of England asked, "Mr. Barrow, why are you in prison?" That's pretty rich. The guy that put him in prison is asking him why he's in prison. He answered, "Upon the statute against recusants." The Lord Treasurer asked, "Why will you not go to church?" Barrow answered, "Because I think that the Church of England, as established by law, is not a church of Christ, nor their manner of worship lawful." Well, that's worth repeating. When asked why he would not go to the church, Mr. Barrow replied, "Because I think that the Church of England, as established by law, is not a church of Christ, nor their manner of worship lawful." And the trial went on. The Lord Treasurer asked, "You complain of injustice. Where have you been wronged?" Barrow replied, "In being kept in prison without due trial and in the misery we suffer by a close imprisonment contrary to law." The Archbishop said, "I've got some proof that you're a heretic." Barrow responded, "That you shall never do. I may be wrong on some things from time to time, but heretic, by grace of God, I will never be." You may have noticed that it seems a bit extraordinary to have the Lord Treasurer of England at a trial. After all, he was in charge of all of the country's spending. He was one of the most powerful men in all of England. He controlled the money. And along with the Lord Treasurer were the Archbishop of England and the Bishop of London, a pair of heavyweights. That's for sure. This is an indication of just how seriously the Queen took such matters. It was noted during the trial that Mr. Barrow did not pay appropriate reverence to the Archbishop and the Bishop of London. He did not grovel. He didn't scrape and bow. He did not keep his head down in their presence. Apparently, he was obviously disrespectful towards the leaders of the church. The chancellor asked him, pointing to the bishops, "Do you know these men?" And Brown answered, "I have cause to know them, but they are not my Lord Bishops. Brown was then asked, by what name would you call them? What would you call the Lord Bishops? Huh? And that, my friends, is what you call the $6 million question. Oh dear, Brown replied, he's a monster, a persecutor, a compound of I know not what, neither ecclesiastical nor civil, but like the second beast spoken of in Revelations. Well, folks, I'm thinking at that moment, although the records don't reflect that, you could have heard a pin drop. Okay, so let me take a brief sidetrack and revisit Revelations 13, 11, 18. Verses the bishops would have known very well, but in Latin. For the sake of those of us who do not keep it fresh in our minds, let me read it to you. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to take an image of the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all but small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Or as Steve pointed out last week, 616. Wow. And in case you've forgotten the description of the first beast that was just referenced, here's a reminder from Revelations 13, 1. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, and 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. And so there you have it. Mr. Barrow just called the Archbishop of England, the leader of every church in England, and the Bishop of London, all of that. Needless to say, along with the odd chemical reference of the he is a compound of I know not what, I don't know what that means, it was certain that there was going to be trouble of the worst kind. The text says that the Archbishop rose up out of his place and said, "My lords, will you suffer him?" And so Mr. Barrow was carried away. Mr. Greenwood was then brought in for his trial. But he refused to swear an oath. Now, I'm certain that this Mr. Greenwood is no relation of mine, but the fact that his surname is the same as mine gives me the chills. The jury brought them all a guilty verdict. Together with Saxio Bellet, Daniel Studley, Mr. Girdler, and Robert Bowl, the fishmonger, they were all condemned to death for disturbance of the state. They would, however, be pardoned if they would just come to church. They would be pardoned if they would just go to church. They protested that their beef was not with the Queen, but with the bishops and the church, all to no avail. Barrow and Greenwood were to be made examples of. The others were set free. They were let go. They had been in prison for the entire year of 1590, They were exposed to all the severities of the cold, the hunger, and nakedness. They begged the queen for mercy in a letter, but the archbishop intercepted the message. They were brought in a cart beneath the gallows in Tyburn for some time, so that they could see and ponder what was ahead of them. Look at the rope and look at the scaffold, and to extract a change in their hearts by the use of fear and intimidation. A second time they came back to Tyburn, but this time they were hanged for real. They say the queen cried when she learned the truth just before their deaths. The men had announced their piety to God and their loyalty to the queen, despite their upcoming hanging and the offer of a pardon, if they would just come to church. And so 2 followers of troubled Church Brown were hanged for distributing his literature and refusing to attend the church. Oh, and calling the bishop, who was in charge of every single church in England, the second beast from Revelations, which by reference also calls him the first beast. They were recusants. They were our forefathers when it comes to the Protestant faith. They pointed out the seemingly obvious problems with the state religion. They longed for a church of Christ. That was their aim. These men were our folks. And so here we are, 400 years later. Oak Hill Drive, Escondido, Church of Christ. And we don't have to be here, and we won't be hanged if we don't show up. We look back at Mr. Barrow and Mr. Greenwood, and we just gasp in amazement. We remember Mr. Barrow's words when he told the bishop, and I quote, "The Church of England, as established by law, is not a church of Christ, nor their manner of worship lawful." I don't know, but I'm guessing they called the archbishop, calling the archbishop the beast of Revelations, excuse me, was what really did him in. I'm feeling grateful to these men. Our lives are never smooth. These men helped clear the way for us. It may not have seemed like it at the time, but their deaths had a profound effect on the Queen. And perhaps because of men like that, we're able to be here, if we want. So let's make the best of it and remember the 100th Psalm, in my mind, one of the best. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know ye that the Lord, he is good, and it is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him, and bless his name. For the Lord is good. His mercy is everlasting, and his truth endureth for all generations. How about that last line? And his truth endureth for all generations. If his truth was strong enough to give courage to Barrow and Greenwood as they looked up at the gallows rope in Tyburn back in their day, his truth is definitely strong enough to help us, guide us along our way. What do you think? Let's pray. Thank you for your word that guides us. Thank you for your truth that is renewed from generation to generation, to strength that has lasted for centuries. Thank you for your mercy that you show us, sometimes recusants. We know that you will give us strength from day to day if we would just ask for it. And if the occasion arises, give us that impossible strength to call a beast a beast. Through Jesus' blood spilled for us, we pray. Amen.